He thought she was just another invisible girl in a cheap apron, the kind of collateral damage powerful men step over without a second glance. So when the undisputed head of the city's criminal underworld looked her up and down, sneered, and ordered her in a language he was certain she couldn't understand, calling her a stray dog begging for scraps, he expected her to bow her head in ignorant compliance. He was wrong, because she didn't just understand him. She answered back. Tessa's feet throbbed in a steady, agonizing rhythm that perfectly matched the low, pulsing bass of the jazz quartet in the corner. It was a Tuesday night at Laura, the kind of downtown establishment where the ambient lighting was kept intentionally dim to mask the exhaustion on the staff's faces, and a single truffle appetizer cost more than Tessa's weekly grocery budget. The air was thick with the scent of roasted duck expensive perfume and the quiet, insulated hum of old money. She stood near the service station, pressing the dull ache in her lower back against the mahogany counter. 7 hours into a double shift. The cheap, stiff polyester of her uniform blouse chafed mercilessly against her collarbone. She had 1 hour left. 1 hour of nodding at men in bespoke suits who snapped their fingers to get her attention, and smiling at women draped in diamonds who complained that the ice in their mineral water was too cold. She picked up a damp cloth and mechanically wiped a fleck of breadcrumb off the rim of an empty bread basket. Her mind wasn't in the dining room. It was calculating the late fee on her electricity bill, weighing it against the cost of a brake pad replacement for her rusted sedan. Life was a relentless spreadsheet of deficits. Cynicism wasn't just a mood for Tessa. It was a survival mechanism. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. Then the ambient temperature in the restaurant seemed to plunge 10 degrees. It wasn't a draft from the kitchen doors. It was a tangible physical shift in the room's atmosphere. The gentle clinking of crystal wine glasses died out, rippling from the front entrance to the back booths like a wave. Even the jazz quartet seemed to lower their volume, the saxophonist pulling his instrument slightly away from his mouth. Tessa looked up from her rag. 3 men had just crossed the threshold of the heavy brass-handled front doors. Actually, 2 of the men walked. The one in the center stalked. He moved with a predatory, loose-limbed grace, owning the imported hardwood floorboards beneath his polished leather shoes. Nikolai Sokolov. Tessa didn't follow the local news, and she certainly didn't care about the city's underground politics, but you didn't work in high-end hospitality without learning the faces of the apex predators. Everyone in the back of house knew Nikolai. He didn't fit the cinematic caricature of a mobster. There were no flashy pinky rings, no cigars, no loud silk shirts. He wore a charcoal suit, tailored so impeccably it appeared molded to his broad frame. His dark hair was ruthlessly neat, his jawline harsh and uncompromising, and his eyes, even from 30 feet away, across a dimly lit room, were flat, dead. They were the eyes of a man who looked at the world and saw only 2 categories. Things he could buy and things he had to break. Claude, the restaurant's typically arrogant maitre d', practically tripped over his own patent leather shoes, rushing to the front. The haughty sneer he usually reserved for tourists evaporated, replaced by a sheen of nervous sweat. "Mr. Sokolov, an honor, as always," Claude stammered, bowing slightly. "Your usual table." Nikolai didn't offer a greeting. He didn't even nod. He merely kept walking, a silent phantom, slicing through the sea of terrified socialites. His bodyguards, thick-necked men whose suit jackets, strained against the heavy bulges at their ribs, flanked him like loyal hounds. They bypassed the main floor entirely, heading straight for the secluded crescent-shaped booth in the far back corner, the one utterly shielded from the street-facing windows, the blind spot. Tessa grabbed her empty serving tray and tucked it under her arm. Not my section, she thought, a brief flare of relief cutting through her fatigue. Thank God, She pivoted toward the swinging kitchen doors, ready to lose herself in the steamy, deafening sanctuary of the dish pit for 5 minutes. A hand clamped onto her forearm. Hard. Tessa flinched, spinning around. It was Sarah, the senior waitress. Sarah was usually a whirlwind of efficient movement and sharp wit, but right now her face was the color of old chalk. Her meticulously applied red lipstick stood out starkly against her pale skin. "Tessa, please, swap with me." "What? No." Tessa frowned, pulling her arm back gently. "My shift is almost over, Sarah. I've got table 4 cashing out, and then I'm done." "I can't take table 9. Sarah's voice was a frantic, thin whisper. Her fingers dug into the edge of her own tray. The guy on the left, the bald one with the scar running through his eyebrow. He was in here last month. I brought him a drink and he backed me into the service hallway near the bathrooms. He whispered what he wanted to do to me. I can't go over there, Tess. I'll shake. I'll drop something. If I mess up, Claude will fire me." Tessa looked at Sarah's trembling hands. Then she looked across the dining room toward table 9. Nikolai was already seated, leaning back against the tufted black leather, staring at his phone with supreme boredom. The scarred man Sarah had mentioned was seated across from him, grinning at the other bodyguard, revealing a row of teeth capped in dull gold. They looked like wolves settling in for a meal perfectly comfortable in the knowledge that everyone else in the room was a sheep. Tessa let out a long, slow breath. The ache in her lower back flared again. She hated this. She hated the way wealth and violence acted as an invisible shield for terrible men. She didn't fear them. Fear required a sense of self-preservation she had largely lost over the last 3 years of grinding poverty. But she was bone-deep, exhausted by them. "Are they eating or just drinking?" Tessa asked, her voice deadpan. "Just drinks, usually. High-end liquor. Keep them full, keep them quiet." Sarah looked at her with desperate, watering eyes. "Fine." Tessa sighed, running a hand over her tightly pinned hair. "Take table 4. They're old money. They tip exactly 18%, no matter what you do. Cash them out." Sarah nearly collapsed with relief, muttering a string of breathless thank yous before darting toward the front of the restaurant. Tessa stood alone for a moment. She straightened her posture, ignoring the screaming muscles in her calves. She smoothed the front of her apron. She pasted on the hollow, dead-eyed smile of a seasoned hospitality worker, adjusted her notepad, and began the long walk across the dining room floor, stepping directly into the lion's den. As Tessa approached the secluded corner booth, the low murmur of conversation between the 3 men became audible over the jazz music. It wasn't English. Harsh consonants, rolling guttural rhythms, a language built for long winters and brutal truths. Russian. Tessa recognized it instantly. Her grandmother, a woman made entirely of iron and stubbornness, had spoken it exclusively in their cramped, drafty apartment until the day she died. Tessa had spent 4 grueling years at a state university, perfecting the grammar, writing sprawling essays on Tolstoy, chasing a linguistics degree. It was a degree that currently helped her do absolutely nothing in the real world, except precisely identify the Moscow street dialect of the criminals who were currently ignoring her existence. They were arguing, or rather the scarred man was arguing. He leaned across the polished mahogany table, gesturing aggressively with thick, calloused fingers. Nikolai sat completely still. He hadn't touched the linen napkin rolled perfectly in front of him. He was a portrait of lethal calm, letting his subordinate vent. Tessa came to a halt at the edge of the table. She clasped her hands in front of her apron. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said. Her voice was smooth, practiced, devoid of any tremble. "Welcome to Laura. Can I start you off with something from our reserve liquor menu?" The scarred man snapped his mouth shut. He whipped his head around and glared at her, his eyes crawling up and down her uniform with blatant, greasy disrespect. "We need a minute, sweetheart. Go fetch some bread." Tessa didn't flinch. She just kept the polite, vacant smile on her face. Actually, Nikolai spoke. It was the first time she had heard his voice. His English was immaculate, carrying only the faintest trace of a cold, metallic accent beneath the syllables. He didn't look at Tessa. He kept his gaze locked on the scarred man, asserting dominance without raising a finger. "I think we are ready." Slowly, deliberately, Nikolai turned his head and finally looked at Tessa. Up close, the impact of his gaze was staggering. His eyes really were the color of slate-cold, unyielding stone that seemed to absorb the dim light rather than reflect it. He looked at her uniform. He noted the fraying threads on her collar. He saw the messy bun holding her hair back, the slight smudge of exhaustion under her eyes, the cheap, scuffed shoes on her feet. He didn't look at her as a woman, or even as a person. He looked at her as a prop, a convenient piece of scenery, a tool to be used in whatever psychological domination game he was currently playing with his loud, scarred subordinate. A slow, cruel, immensely amused smirk touched the corner of Nikolai's mouth. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, steepling his fingers. He switched back to Russian. He didn't whisper. He projected his voice just enough so his men could hear every syllable clearly. His eyes stayed locked onto Tessa's face, waiting for the inevitable. The blank, confused, subservient American stare of an uneducated waitress. "Prinesim ne whiskey," Nikolai said, in perfectly enunciated Russian. "Bring me whiskey." He paused, letting the foreign words hang in the air between them. But he wasn't finished. He wanted to make a point to his men about power. "I Chevelis's Sobaka," he continued, his tone conversational, as if he were discussing the weather. "Takaya deshevka kak ti dolzna bit blagodarna, zato što dishit odnim vozdukom so mной. Viglia dish, tak budto nedelju ne mailas." And move quickly, dog. A cheap whore like you should be grateful to breathe the same air as me. You look like you haven't washed in a week. The scarred man let out a harsh, barking snort of laughter. The other bodyguard chuckled a low, sycophantic sound. They looked at Tessa, their expressions dripping with contempt. They were waiting for her reaction. They were waiting for the standard script to play out. They expected her to maintain her customer service smile, to blink in confusion, to say, "I'm sorry, sir, I don't understand, let me get a menu." They expected her to scurry away like a frightened mouse, perfectly proving Nikolai's unspoken point to his crew, that everyone outside their violent, insulated circle was stupid, pathetic, and meant to be stepped on. Tessa stood perfectly still. Her heart gave a single, massive, painful thump against her ribs. Heat, sudden and scorching, flared in the back of her neck. It wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't fear. It was rage. Pure, unadulterated, working-class rage. She was so incredibly tired. She was broke. She had spent her morning on hold for 45 minutes, begging a utility company customer service rep not to shut off her electricity. She had spent the last 7 hours carrying plates of food that cost more than her car being treated like animated furniture by people who thought wealth replaced basic human decency. And now this arrogant, blood-soaked sociopath in a $5,000 suit thought he could use her as a punchline. He thought he could sit in his ivory tower of violence and demean her to make himself look like a god in front of his thugs. Tessa didn't break eye contact. She didn't let her polite smile falter. The silence at the table stretched. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. Nikolai tilted his head slightly, his smirk deepening, waiting for her to apologize for her ignorance, waiting for her to break. Tessa calmly reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out her order notepad. She retrieved her cheap plastic pen. She clicked it. Click. The sound was sharp and unnaturally loud in the sudden tense quiet of the booth. She looked right into Nikolai's dead slate eyes. She let her customer service smile drop. Her face went completely blank, her posture straightening as she shed the subservient waitress persona like a heavy coat. "Whiskey," Tessa said. The word hung in the air. The table froze. The scarred man's laughter died in his throat with a choking sound. The other bodyguard stiffened his hand, drifting instinctively toward his chest. Tessa didn't raise her voice. She didn't yell. She spoke the language with the casual, razor-sharp fluency of a native, her accent carrying the specific working-class grit of the Moscow suburbs, a flawless mirror to the cadence he had just used. "Kakoi imeno?" Tessa asked, leaning forward just a fraction of an inch. "Unasest deshevoe poilo dla tvoi psov." She flicked her eyes briefly toward the scarred man, then brought them right back to Nikolai. "A koroshi kotori tis możesz, oplatit, esli poprosisz, vejlivo." Which kind exactly? We have the cheap swill for your dogs, and the good stuff that you can afford if you ask politely. Nikolai's smirk vanished entirely. The amusement was wiped from his features, replaced by something entirely unreadable. For the first time in perhaps a decade, genuine profound shock flashed across the untouchable mob boss's face. A muscle in his tight jaw jumped. Tessa wasn't done. The rage was a cold, driving force in her blood now. She leaned down further, resting one hand on the edge of the mahogany table, invading his space, bringing her face inches from his. "Idlia spravki," she continued softly, her voice dripping with absolute ice. "Ja prinyala dushu trom, et od tebia neset kroviu, I deshevim ode kolonom. Što ni budesce, ili ti budeš, produljat, tratit moe vremia. And for the record, I showered this morning. You're the one who reeks of blood and cheap cologne. Will there be anything else, or are you going to keep wasting my time?" The silence that followed was absolute. It was a suffocating vacuum. It was the kind of heavy, breathless silence that usually preceded a gunshot in an alleyway. The scarred man let out a feral snarl. He practically launched himself upward, his hand plunging violently into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Tessa didn't blink. She kept her eyes locked with Nikolai's. She knew exactly what she had just done. You didn't speak to men like this in that tone. You didn't strip them of their power in front of their subordinates. She had just signed her own death warrant over a bruised ego. She waited for the explosion. She waited for the cold steel, the violence, the screaming of the other patrons. Nikolai raised his right hand. It was a sharp, singular micro-motion, barely a flick of his wrist. The scarred man froze mid-lunge. His hand remained buried in his coat, his chest heaving with fury, but he didn't move another inch. He obeyed the silent command instantly, like a dog choking on a spiked collar. Nikolai didn't look at his guard. He just stared at Tessa. She stared back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, refusing to look away first. Slowly, impossibly, the corners of Nikolai's mouth twitched. A low rumbling sound started deep in his chest. It vibrated through the silence of the table. He was laughing. It wasn't a booming, theatrical laugh. It was a dark, dangerous, genuine sound that made the hairs on the back of Tessa's neck stand up. He leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest, looking at her as if she had just materialized out of thin air. The flat, dead look in his slate eyes was gone. It was replaced by a sudden, terrifyingly intense fire. "Macallan 25, Nikolai said, switching smoothly back to English. His voice was suddenly very quiet, dropping an octave. It held no anger, only a razor-sharp focus. "Neat. 3 glasses. Tessa stood up straight, pulling herself out of his orbit. Her legs felt like they were made of water, but she kept her face completely neutral. She clicked her pen shut. "Of course, sir," she said, in perfectly polite, unbothered English. "Right away." She turned on her heel and walked toward the bar. She didn't hurry. She didn't run. She walked with measured, steady steps, even though she could feel the heavy, searing weight of his stare boring into her spine the entire way. When she reached the brass railing of the bar, she gripped it so hard her knuckles turned white. The bartender, a lanky college kid named Josh, took one look at her pale face and stopped wiping down the counter. "Jesus, Tess, you okay? You look like you just watched a car crash." "3 Macallan 25s, neat," Tessa said, her voice tight, barely pushing the words past the lump in her throat. "And pour me a double shot of the rail tequila while you're at it. Put it on my tab." Josh frowned, glancing nervously toward the back corner, but he didn't argue. He poured the cheap well tequila and slid the shot glass across the mat. Tessa picked it up with a slightly trembling hand and threw it back. The cheap liquor burned like battery acid all the way down to her stomach, grounding her. She took a deep breath. She had survived the encounter. She just needed to put the glasses on a tray, drop them off at the table in silence, avoid eye contact, and survive the next 45 minutes until her shift mercifully ended. Then she would go home, lock her deadbolt, and never ever think about Nikolai Sokolov again. Josh set the 3 crystal glasses of expensive scotch on her tray. Tessa picked it up. She turned around to face the dining room floor, but as she looked toward the back corner, her breath caught. Nikolai wasn't looking at his phone anymore. He wasn't talking to his men. He was completely ignoring the scarred bodyguard who was still glaring daggers in her direction. Nikolai was sitting perfectly still, resting his chin on his steepled hands. He was watching the bar. He was watching her. The supreme dead-eyed boredom was gone. The apex predator had just found something entirely new in his mundane, violent world. He had found a puzzle. Tessa realized with a cold, sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach that her shift might be ending, but this nightmare was only just beginning. The walk back to table 9 took exactly 42 seconds. Tessa counted every single step. The heavy mahogany tray balanced on her palm felt like it was made of lead. 3 crystal glasses of Macallan 25 sat perfectly centered on the cork mat, the amber liquid catching the dim overhead lighting. The jazz band was playing a slow, mournful rendition of a Cole Porter classic, the brushed snare drum hissing like a dying radiator. As she closed the distance, the scarred bodyguard Dane she'd heard Claude call him once shifted his bulk. His thick neck was flushed a dark, mottled red, the collar of his dress shirt straining against his sudden, violent tension. He looked like a pit bull choking on a leash. Tessa didn't look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on the center of the table. She arrived at the crescent booth. The silence among the 3 men was dense enough to suffocate in. She lowered the tray. "Macallan 25. Neat," she said. Her voice was terrifyingly steady. The tequila shot she'd swallowed at the bar sat like a warm, heavy stone in her empty stomach, anchoring her frayed nerves. She placed the first glass in front of the second bodyguard, a younger man with dead eyes and a broken nose. He didn't blink. She placed the second glass in front of Dane. He let out a low, wet breath through his teeth, his hand twitching on the table. Finally, she picked up the third glass. She set it directly in front of Nikolai. He hadn't moved since she walked away. His hands were still steepled under his chin, his slate-grey eyes tracking her every micro-expression. He wasn't glaring. He wasn't trying to intimidate her anymore. The terrifying reality was that he looked entirely, deeply fascinated. It was the look of a biologist who had just discovered a new, venomous species of insect under a microscope. "Will there be anything else tonight, sir?" Tessa asked. She kept to the script, English, deferential but entirely hollow. Nikolai picked up the heavy crystal glass. He didn't break eye contact as he brought it to his lips and took a slow, deliberate sip. The scotch cost $200 a pour. He drank it like tap water. "No," he said quietly, his voice barely carried over the jazz music. "Bring the check." Tessa nodded once, crisp and professional. She turned and walked away. She didn't breathe until she was behind the swinging double doors of the kitchen. The sudden blast of heat, shouting line cooks, and clattering ceramic plates hit her like a physical blow. She backed up against the cool stainless steel of the walk-in refrigerator door and squeezed her eyes shut. Her knees finally gave out, trembling so violently she had to brace her hands against her thighs to stay upright. "You idiot," she thought, the cynical voice in her head screaming at her. "You absolute suicidal idiot. What did you just do?" She had let a moment of exhaustion-fueled pride overrule 3 years of bitter survival instincts. You didn't talk back to men who bought off judges and buried their problems in concrete. You swallowed your pride, took the insult, and went home to your crappy apartment. That was the contract of the working poor. She had just torn it up and set it on fire. "Tessa," she snapped her eyes open. Claude was marching toward her, his face slick with panic. He clutched a small leather-bound checkbook in his manicured hands. "What did you do?" Claude hissed, grabbing her elbow and dragging her slightly away from the prep line. "What did you say to him?" "I took their order, Claude," Tessa said, keeping her face blank. She pulled her arm free. "They are leaving. After one drink." Sokolov never leaves after one drink. He usually stays until closing and runs up a $3,000 tab. Claude's voice was rising to a shrill pitch. "If you offended him, if you spilled so much as a drop of water on his shoes, I will personally ruin you in this city. You won't get a job scraping gum off subway platforms." Tessa grabbed the leather book from his hands. "I'll take the check out right now." She pushed past him, her jaw locked. She printed the receipt at the service station. $600 plus tax. She placed the slip of paper into the leather presenter, smoothed down her apron, and walked back out to the dining room floor. The booth was empty. Tessa stopped dead in her tracks. The 3 glasses of Macallan sat on the table. 2 were completely full. Nikolai's was half empty. The men were gone. She approached the table slowly, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Had they walked out? Had she made them so angry they just left? Claude was going to dock the $600 from her pay, which meant she wouldn't make rent. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through her stoicism. She reached the table and looked down. Sitting perfectly centered on the dark wood, right next to the leather checkbook, was a stack of bills. Tessa picked up the book. She opened it. The receipt was still there. She looked at the cash. They were crisp, uncirculated $100 bills. She didn't want to touch them. They felt radioactive. But she reached out and flicked the edge of the stack with her thumb. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That covered the drinks. 7, 8, 9, 10. She kept counting. Her breath hitched. 20, 30, 40, 50. $5,000. There was a note tucked under the bottom bill, written on the back of a thick, cream-colored business card. The handwriting was sharp, elegant, and aggressive. "For the shower. Keep your mouth shut and your eyes open." Tessa stared at the ink. The heavy weight of the cash in her hand didn't feel like a blessing. It didn't feel like rent money or new brake pads or a sigh of relief. It felt like a down payment. It felt like a trap closing around her ankle. She shoved the $5,000 deep into her apron pocket, dropped the $600 for the bill into the leather book, and practically ran back to the kitchen. The employee locker room smelled like stale fry oil bleach and defeated ambitions. Tessa sat on the narrow wooden bench, staring blankly at the rusted metal door of her locker. The clock on the wall read 2:15 a.m. The restaurant was finally dead, the heavy front doors locked. The last of the aristocratic patrons poured into their waiting town cars. She had managed to avoid Sarah's panicked questions and Claude's suspicious glares. She had turned in her checkout report, handed over the exact cash for Table 9's bill, and kept her mouth entirely shut. The stack of $100 bills was currently shoved to the very bottom of her faded canvas tote bag, wrapped in a spare sweater. Every time she glanced at the bag, her stomach turned over. She unpinned her hair, letting the heavy, dark mass fall over her shoulders. Her scalp ached. Her feet throbbed with a dull, insistent rhythm that radiated all the way up her calves. She traded her stiff, polyester uniform blouse for an oversized grey hoodie, zipped it up to her chin and slung the tote bag over her shoulder. She just needed to get home. She needed to lock her deadbolt, take a scalding shower, and convince herself that tomorrow would just be another miserable, ordinary Wednesday. Tessa pushed open the heavy steel fire door at the back of the kitchen and stepped out into the alley. The cold night air hit her like a wet towel. It had rained while she was inside the cobblestones, slick and shimmering under the sickly yellow glow of a single sodium street lamp. The alley was quiet, smelling of wet cardboard and exhaust fumes. The staff parking lot was a block away, a cracked asphalt square, tucked beneath the rusted spine of the elevated train tracks. She pulled her hood up against the damp chill and started walking. Her rusted 2011 Chevy sedan was parked in the far corner, tucked against a chain-link fence. The passenger side headlight was taped over, and the muffler rattled like a coffee can full of pennies. But it was hers. It was a metal cage that moved. Right now, that was all she wanted in the world. Tessa gripped her car keys in her pocket, sliding one of the brass keys between her knuckles. A habit born of living in a neighborhood where the street lights were usually broken and the sirens never stopped. She was 50 feet away from her car when the shadows moved. It wasn't sudden. It was a slow, deliberate bleed of darkness separating from the concrete pylons beneath the train tracks. Two massive silhouettes stepped out from the gloom, blocking the narrow path to her car. Even in the awful lighting, Tessa recognized the broad, tailored shoulders and the thick necks. Dane and the other one. Her heart didn't just drop. It plummeted into her shoes, heavy and icy. Her grip tightened on the keys in her pocket until the metal bit into her skin. She stopped walking. She was alone. There were no cameras here, no wealthy patrons to act as a buffer. Just the distant echoing rumble of a garbage truck 3 streets over, and the steady dripping of rainwater from the tracks above. Behind the two men, the headlights of a massive black SUV flared to life, blindingly bright. The engine purred a low, expensive growl that vibrated against the wet asphalt. The back door of the SUV swung open. Nikolai stepped out. He had discarded his suit jacket. He wore only a black dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to expose thick forearms corded with muscle and laced with dark, intricate tattoos. Without the tailored jacket, he looked less like a businessman and entirely like a brawler. He didn't look like he belonged in a fine dining restaurant. He looked like he belonged exactly here, in the cold, wet dark of an alleyway. He walked slowly toward her, his footsteps eerily silent on the pavement. The bodyguards parted seamlessly to let him through their eyes, locked on Tessa with lethal intent. Dane's jaw was clenched so tight, the scarred tissue on his face pulled taut. Nikolai stopped 10 feet away. He didn't speak immediately. He just looked at her. He took in the cheap hoodie, the worn-out sneakers, the defensive posture, the way she was subtly angling her body toward the street exit. "You didn't run," Nikolai said. His voice was a low rumble, carrying effortlessly through the damp air. He spoke in English. Most people would have taken the money and caught a bus out of the state. Tessa forced her jaw to unclench. She wouldn't let her voice shake. Not here. Not in front of them. "I have a shift on Thursday," she said flatly, "and $5,000 barely covers first last and a security deposit on a new apartment. It doesn't buy a new life." Nikolai's mouth twitched. That same dark amusement flared in his slate-gray eyes. "Pragmatic. I like that. It saves me the trouble of hunting you down at a bus terminal." "What do you want?" Tessa asked. The exhaustion was suddenly heavier than her fear. She was so incredibly tired of rich men playing games with her existence. "You left a tip. You proved you have more money than God. I kept my mouth shut. Transaction complete. Let me go to my car. Nikolai took 2 steps closer. The scent of him washed over her, not the cheap cologne she had mocked, but the sharp, clean smell of expensive soap, dark roasted coffee, and the metallic tang of cold rain. "The money wasn't a tip, Tessa," he said softly. Hearing her name in his mouth sent a violent shudder down her spine. He shouldn't know her name. Her name tag had been covered by her apron bib all night. It was a retainer. He continued closing the distance until he was standing a mere 3 feet away. He towered over her, radiating a heavy gravitational heat. "You have a degree in Eastern European linguistics from a state university. You took out $80,000 in loans to attend. You owe $4,000 in back property taxes on a house in the South Ward that belonged to a grandmother who passed away 2 years ago. Your electricity was scheduled to be shut off at noon tomorrow." Tessa's breath caught in her throat. The cold air suddenly felt like crushed glass in her lungs. He hadn't just been sitting at that table drinking scotch. In the 45 minutes between her bringing the drinks and leaving the shift, his people had ripped her entire life apart. They had opened her up and laid all her miserable, desperate secrets out on a table for him to examine. "You invaded my privacy," she spat, her voice trembling now but with fury, not fear. "I assessed an asset," Nikolai corrected smoothly, his expression entirely detached. "You are broke, Tessa. You are drowning. You work 60 hours a week carrying plates for people who wouldn't notice if you dropped dead on the floor, and you are still losing the game. And you're going to kill me because I bruised your ego in front of your muscle." She glared up at him, her chest heaving. "Go ahead. You'll be doing my creditors a favor." For a fraction of a second, surprise flashed in Nikolai's eyes. Then he laughed, a genuine rough sound that echoed off the wet brick walls. "Kill you." He shook his head, leaning down slightly so his face was level with hers. "You stood in front of 3 armed men, recognized exactly what we were, and instead of cowering, you insulted my hygiene in perfect Moscow gutter slang. Do you have any idea how rare that kind of suicidal arrogance is?" He reached out. Tessa flinched, but he didn't strike her. He casually flicked the edge of her grey hood. "I don't want to kill you, Tessa. I want to hire you." Tessa stared at him, the rain beginning to fall harder, slicking Nikolai's dark hair against his forehead. The absurdity of the statement short-circuited her brain for a moment. "Hire me," she repeated the words, tasting like ash. "To do what? Insult your enemies? Pour your scotch?" Nikolai's amusement faded, replaced by the flat, dead-eyed calculation of a predator cornering its prey. He stepped back, gesturing casually to the massive black SUV. "I have a meeting tomorrow night," Nikolai said, his tone shifting into something purely professional, as if they were discussing a corporate merger in a boardroom instead of standing in a dark alley with armed thugs. "With a faction from Brighton Beach. They are old world. Paranoiac. They refuse to speak English during negotiations, and they refuse to allow known translators into the room." Tessa frowned, her linguistic brain kicking in despite the terror. "If you speak the language, why do you need a translator?" "Because," Nikolai said softly, "they lie. They speak to me in the formal dialect, and they whisper to each other in a regional slang from the Ural Mountains. They think I don't catch the nuance. I need someone in the room who understands every breath they take, but who they won't perceive as a threat." Tessa's eyes darted to Dane, then back to Nikolai. "And you think I don't look like a threat? You look like a waitress," Nikolai said, bluntly, stripping away any pretense of politeness. "You look like a broke, exhausted, invisible girl. I will bring you in as collateral arm candy. They will see a pretty face in a cheap dress. They will assume you are there to pour drinks and look decorative. They won't censor themselves around you." "You want me to be a spy?" Tessa whispered. "For the Mafia. I want you to be a microphone, Nikolai corrected. You stand there, you look pretty, you listen, and when it's over, you tell me exactly what they whispered while they smiled at me. No. Tessa took a step back, her grip tightening on her keys. Absolutely not. I'm not getting involved in your turf wars. I'll give you the 5,000 back right now. I don't want your money. Nikolai didn't move, but the air around him seemed to solidify. The temperature in the alley dropped. The 5,000 was just to guarantee you didn't leave the city tonight. Nikolai said, his voice dropping to a silken, dangerous whisper. If you do this for me tomorrow, I will clear the $80,000 in student loans. I will pay the property tax on your grandmother's house. I will wipe the board clean, Tessa. You wake up on Thursday, and you are free. Tessa froze. $84,000. It was a number so large it didn't even feel real to her. It was a crushing, invisible weight that she had accepted would slowly smother her for the rest of her natural life. To wake up and have it gone. To own the tiny house outright. To not panic every time the mail carrier dropped an envelope in the slot. She looked at Nikolai's face. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was a master of leverage. He hadn't threatened her life. He had offered her the one thing she couldn't refuse. He was offering her a future. And if things go wrong, Tessa asked, her voice raspy. What if they figure out I understand them? What do they do to collateral arm Candy? Dane let out a dark, ugly chuckle from the shadows. Nikolai shot the bodyguard a look so violently cold, the sound instantly died. Nikolai looked back at Tessa. They won't figure it out, because you are going to play the dumb, subservient American girl perfectly. He stepped closer, his chest almost brushing hers, forcing her to tilt her head up to meet his eyes. You showed me tonight that you can turn your fear into ice, Tessa. Tomorrow you will do it again. I don't have a choice, do I? She said bitterly, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a hollow, cynical resignation. Choices are a luxury for the rich, Nikolai said, quietly, lifting a hand. He didn't touch her skin, but his knuckles lightly grazed the zipper of her cheap hoodie. The contrast of his bespoke shirt and her frayed clothing was jarring. You and I both know that. He pulled a slim black burner phone from his pocket and held it out to her. Tessa stared at the plastic device. It looked like a detonator. If she took it, the invisible line between her miserable ordinary life and his world of blood and money would be crossed forever. She thought about the shut-off notice on her kitchen counter. She thought about the endless aching hours on her feet at Laura. Slowly, her hand trembling just a fraction, she reached out and took the phone. Nikolai's mouth curved into a slow, satisfied smile. It wasn't cruel this time. It was the smile of a man who had just acquired a very valuable, very dangerous new toy. Be ready at 8 tomorrow night, Nikolai said, turning his back on her and walking toward the open door of the SUV. My driver will bring a dress. Wear it. What if it doesn't fit? Tessa called out, a final weak spike of defiance in her voice. Nikolai paused at the door. He looked back over his shoulder, his eyes sweeping down her body with a clinical, terrifying precision that made her face burn. It will fit, he said softly. He climbed into the car. The heavy door slammed shut with the finality of a vault locking. The bodyguards seamlessly piled into the front seats, and the massive engine roared. The SUV pulled away its red taillights, bleeding into the wet darkness of the street, leaving Tessa alone in the alley. She stood frozen under the flickering streetlight, clutching the black phone in one hand and the straps of her tote bag in the other. The rain began to fall in heavy, freezing sheets, soaking through her hoodie, but she didn't move. Tomorrow she wouldn't be a waitress anymore. She belonged to Nikolai Sokolov. Tessa's apartment smelled of burnt coffee and mildew. It was a smell she had long ago stopped noticing, but as she stood in the center of her cramped living room on Wednesday afternoon, The scent felt utterly suffocating. The cardboard box sat on her battered coffee table. It was matte black, tied with a thick silk ribbon. No logo. No return address. The burner phone Nikolai had given her rested right beside it, an inert slab of plastic that hadn't buzzed or beeped once in the last 12 hours. She had spent the morning paying her electric bill. She walked to the utility office, handed the clerk 2 of the crisp $100 bills, and walked out into the pale morning sunlight with a receipt. It felt like a fever dream. The remaining $4,800 was stuffed inside an empty oatmeal canister in her pantry. She had checked it 4 times. Tessa reached out and pulled the ribbon on the box. It fell away flawlessly. She lifted the lid. The dress inside was the color of a bruised plum. Deep, dark, burgundy silk. She picked it up by the narrow shoulder straps, letting the fabric unspool. It was heavy, constructed, with a terrifying attention to detail. There were no tags. It had been made for someone, and judging by Nikolai's icy confidence in the alleyway, it had been made specifically for her measurements. She stripped off her oversized t-shirt and sweatpants, her skin breaking out in goosebumps in the drafty room. She stepped into the silk. It slid over her skin like cool water. She reached around, pulling the hidden zipper up her spine. The dress tightened, clinging to her ribs, smoothing over her hips, and falling in a sleek, liquid drape to her ankles. It wasn't overtly revealing the neckline, draped elegantly across her collarbones, but it was weaponized clothing. It was designed to draw the eye and hold it hostage. Tessa looked at herself in the cracked mirror, mounted on her bathroom door. The exhaustion under her eyes was still there. Her hair was still her own. But the girl staring back didn't look like someone who worried about the price of brake pads. She looked expensive. She looked like collateral. At exactly 7:55 p.m., the burner phone vibrated. A single text message. Downstairs. She threw a worn black trench coat over the silk, grabbed her keys, and walked out the door. The black SUV was idling against the curb, a massive shadow, eating up the weak light from the street lamp. The rear passenger door opened as she approached. Dane sat in the front passenger seat, his scarred face illuminated by the dashboard lights. He didn't look back. Tessa climbed into the cavernous back seat. The door thumped shut behind her, plunging her into the thick, leather-scented darkness. Nikolai sat on the far side of the bench. He wore a dark navy suit tonight. The tie discarded the collar of his white shirt open. The ambient city lights sliding across the tinted windows caught the sharp, uncompromising angles of his face. He looked at her as she settled into the seat. His eyes tracked from the hem of her coat to her face. He didn't offer a compliment. A compliment would have been cheap. "The coat comes off in the car," Nikolai said. His voice was business, flat, focused. Tessa unbuttoned the trench coat and let it slide off her shoulders, leaving it pooled on the seat between them. Nikolai's gaze dropped to the burgundy silk for a fraction of a second, before returning to her eyes. "The men we are meeting run the docks," Nikolai explained, his tone shifting into a cold briefing. "Their leader calls himself Simon. His second is Garrett. They anglicized their names a decade ago to secure city contracts, but they bleed the old country. They are vicious territorial and currently bleeding my shipping routes dry." "If they are stealing from you, why are we negotiating?" Tessa asked, staring straight ahead at the partition separating them from the driver. "Because war in the streets brings the FBI. War in a boardroom brings concessions." Nikolai shifted his weight, closing the distance between them just slightly. The air in the cab grew tighter. "You will sit on my right. You will drink whatever they pour you, but you will not swallow it. Spit it back into the glass under the pretense of taking a delicate sip. You will laugh if they make a joke. You will look incredibly bored the rest of the time." And the translating. "You say absolutely nothing," Nikolai commanded softly. "You listen to the slang. The Ural mountain dialect is guttural. They swallow their vowels. They will use it to communicate numbers, timelines, and leverage right in front of me. Memorize everything. When we leave, you recite it. Tessa swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry. What if they address me directly? Nikolai reached out. His large, warm hand clamped gently but firmly over her knee. The contact sent a jolt of pure adrenaline straight into her chest. They won't, he said, his thumb brushing the silk once, before he pulled his hand away. To them you are furniture. Play the part. The restaurant was a fortress, disguised as a high-end steakhouse. It sat at the edge of the industrial district, surrounded by empty warehouses and broken concrete. Dane led the way through the heavy oak doors, bypassing the hostess stand completely. They walked down a long, dimly lit hallway, panelled in dark cherry wood, the muffled sounds of the main dining room fading into absolute silence. At the end of the hall stood a pair of heavy iron-studded doors. Two men in ill-fitting suits stood guard. They patted Dane down their hands, moving with practiced efficiency. They didn't touch Nikolai, and true to Nikolai's word, they didn't even glance at Tessa. She was a ghost in a beautiful dress. Dane pushed the doors open. The private room was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of charred meat. A massive circular table dominated the space. Two men sat on the far side. Simon was an older man, his face a map of deep, weathered lines. He had a thick mane of silver hair and wore a velvet dinner jacket that looked vaguely ridiculous over his wide, barrel-like chest. Beside him sat Garrett. Garrett was younger, entirely bald, with a face that looked like it had been repeatedly struck by heavy machinery. His eyes were small, wet, and relentlessly cruel. Nikolai Simon boomed in English, throwing his arms wide without standing up. "You brought a guest. We didn't prepare a plate." "She already ate," Nikolai replied in perfect formal Russian. He pulled out a chair for Tessa. It was an old-school proprietary gesture. He was establishing ownership. Tessa sat. She crossed her legs, slanting them toward Nikolai, and let her shoulders drop into a posture of elegant exhaustion. She modelled her expression after the wealthy wives she served at Laura Women, who found the entire world fundamentally uninteresting. Simon switched to formal Russian, his smile never reaching his eyes. "You look well, Nikolai. The city treats you kindly. The city treats the organized kindly," Nikolai countered smoothly, taking his seat. "I am here about Pier 44. You have locked down 3 of my containers." The negotiation began. It was a dense, verbal chess match. They discussed tariffs, union payoffs, and dockside security in looping, indirect circles. Tessa maintained her vacant stare. A waiter appeared like a phantom, pouring crystal flutes of champagne. Tessa took one, brought it to her lips, and let the carbonated liquid wet her tongue before lowering the glass. 20 minutes in, the tension in the room began to thicken. The formal Russian was growing sharper, the pleasantries stripped away. Then Simon leaned back in his chair. He picked up his cigar. He looked at Garrett. "Shchali." The word was a harsh, grinding sound. It wasn't formal Russian. Tessa's mind raced, flipping through hundreds of hours of linguistic study. Shali, Ural slang. It meant the dogs. Garrett didn't look at Simon. He kept his eyes fixed on the center of the table, his thick fingers turning his champagne flute. He replied in a rapid, muted growl. "Vesevi budka, zdut stuk." They are all in the kennel. Waiting for the knock. Tessa's blood ran cold. The air in her lungs turned to ice. She took another fake sip of her champagne to hide the sudden violent tremor in her hands. "The dogs are in the kennel, waiting for the knock." They weren't talking about freight containers. Simon smiled, turning back to Nikolai. He switched back to the formal, polite Moscow dialect. "We can release the containers by tomorrow morning. A simple misunderstanding of paperwork. We value our peace with you, Nikolai." As Simon spoke, Garrett's right hand slipped off the table. It vanished into the space between his thigh and his jacket. Tessa's eyes flicked to Garrett's shoulder. She saw the heavy muscle under his suit jacket flex. She saw the fabric pulled tight across his chest. He was reaching for a weapon. At the same time, Simon shifted his weight. He was preparing to stand up, or throw himself backward, waiting for the knock. The knock wasn't a signal from outside. It was the gunshot. They weren't going to let Nikolai leave this room. They had lured him here to sever the head of his organization in one clean, bloody stroke. Tessa couldn't wait. She couldn't act as a microphone for a dead man. She didn't think. Instinct, raw and desperate, took the wheel. She let out a sudden, high-pitched, entirely artificial laugh. It cut through Simon's polite sentence like a siren. She practically threw herself sideways, her shoulder colliding heavily against Nikolai's chest, throwing her arms around his neck as if she were a drunk socialite starved for affection. The abrupt, chaotic movement startled the entire table. Simon flinched. Garrett's shoulder froze, his draw interrupted by the sudden shift in the room's dynamic. Tessa buried her face into the crook of Nikolai's neck. He was rigid as stone beneath her. "Gun!" She breathed, her voice barely a vibration against his skin, English, frantic. Under table, right hand, now. She didn't wait for him to process it. She kept moving, continuing her clumsy, drunken fall. Her right hand swept brutally across the table. Her fingers caught the heavy silver ice bucket, chilling the spare champagne. She dragged it down with all her weight. The heavy bucket, the ice and the heavy glass bottle slammed violently onto the mahogany table and tipped over, crashing directly into Garrett's lap. Ice water and freezing glass exploded across the mobster. Garrett let out a roaring curse in raw Russian, his hands flying up from beneath the table to shield his face, completely abandoning the weapon he had been gripping. Nikolai didn't need a second warning. The apex predator didn't freeze. The moment the ice bucket shattered Nikolai's left arm, locked around Tessa's waist like a vice, yanking her brutally backward, pulling her entirely out of her chair and throwing her to the thick carpet behind him. At the exact same instant, his right hand blurred. Tessa hit the floor hard, the breath knocked from her lungs. The world erupted into deafening noise. It wasn't the cinematic, echoing bang of a movie. It was a sharp, cracking roar that physically assaulted the eardrums. Crack, crack. Tessa curled into a ball, pressing her hands over her ears, burying her face into the heavy burgundy silk. The smell of copper ozone and burnt sulfur instantly overwhelmed the cigar smoke. Heavy bodies crashed against the mahogany table. Wood splintered. Someone screamed a wet, gargling sound. Crack. A third shot. Then absolute ringing silence. Tessa squeezed her eyes shut, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. Her chest heaved, pulling in the toxic air. She waited for the pain. She waited for the burning tear of a bullet. It didn't come. Heavy footsteps crunched over broken glass. Strong hands gripped her shoulders. She shrieked blindly, thrashing backward. "Tessa, stop!" The voice was low, calm, English. She opened her eyes. Nikolai was kneeling over her. His navy suit was impeccably clean, save for a single stark splash of crimson across his white collar. His slate-grey eyes were devoid of panic. He looked at her, not with the clinical detachment of a boss assessing a tool, but with a sharp, burning intensity she had never seen before. He didn't offer a hand. He slid his arms under her back and beneath her knees, lifting her completely off the floor in one fluid, effortless motion. Tessa looked over his shoulder as he carried her toward the heavy iron doors. Simon was slumped over the table, his face buried in the spilled ice blood, pooling rapidly across the polished wood. Garrett was on his back on the floor, his eyes wide and vacant, staring at the ceiling. Dane stood near the corner, holstering a heavy black pistol beneath his jacket, his scarred face twisted into a grimace of pure adrenaline. They walked back down the long cherry-wood hallway. The restaurant was completely silent. The guards at the door were gone. Nikolai kicked the heavy front doors open, stepping out into the freezing night air. The ride back was a suffocating vacuum. Tessa huddled against the far door of the SUV, her knees pulled tight against her chest, the oversized black trench coat wrapped around her like a shield. She couldn't stop shivering. The adrenaline was draining out of her system, leaving behind a cold, hollow nausea that made her want to claw out of her own skin. She had just watched 2 men die. She had caused it. If she hadn't tipped the ice bucket, Nikolai would have been the one bleeding out on the mahogany table. She had crossed the line. She wasn't just a waitress who mouthed off in a diner anymore. She was a participant in a massacre. Nikolai sat across from her. He hadn't spoken a word since he put her in the car. He was typing methodically on his encrypted phone, his face bathed in the pale blue light of the screen. He looked completely terrifyingly normal. It was just another Wednesday night for him. The SUV slowed the tires hissing over the wet pavement. They pulled up to the curb outside Tessa's apartment building. The engine idled. The silence in the back of the cab stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing against Tessa's chest. She needed to get out. She needed to scrub her skin until it was raw. She reached for the door handle. Wait. Nikolai's voice was quiet, but it stopped her instantly. He hit a button on his phone and set it face down on the leather seat. He looked at her. Really looked at her. The flat, predatory deadness was entirely gone from his eyes. He was looking at her the way a man looks at an anchor in a storm. Your student loans were held by a private equity firm. They are paid in full. Nikolai said, his voice a low, steady rumble. The city tax office just received a wire transfer for your grandmother's property. The deed is clear. Tessa stared at him. She felt no relief. The crushing weight of the $84,000 was gone, but it had been instantly replaced by the phantom smell of cordite in her hair. I don't want your money anymore, Tessa whispered, her voice cracking. I just want to go back to my life. You don't have that life anymore, Tessa, Nikolai said bluntly. It wasn't a threat. It was a cold, objective fact. You walked into a room with the worst men in this city. You didn't panic. You didn't freeze. You translated a dead slang dialect in real time, identified an assassination attempt, and executed a physical disruption that saved my life. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, bringing his face dangerously close to hers. Waitresses drop plates when someone yells at them, Nikolai murmured. You drop men who try to pull guns? You are not a waitress. You never were. You were just waiting to be woken up. I am not a killer. Tessa snapped a flash of defensive rage piercing through her shock. No, Nikolai agreed softly. You are the one who tells the killers where to point the gun. That makes you infinitely more dangerous. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a sleek, heavy black card. It wasn't a business card. It was a secured access key. He held it out to her. I paid your debts, Nikolai said. Our transaction is complete. You can walk out of this car, lock your deadbolt, and go back to serving overpriced duck to people who look right through you. I will never contact you again. You have my word. Tessa looked at the black card in his hand. Or, Nikolai continued, his voice dropping to a silken, hypnotic whisper, you take this. You come to the estate tomorrow at noon. You stand at my right hand. You listen to the world, and you tell me what it's saying. I will pay you $10,000 a week. No one will ever look through you again. No one will ever speak down to you again. Tessa stared at the card. Her mind screamed at her to open the car door and run. Run back to the mildew and the rusted Chevy. Run back to the exhaustion and the safety of being invisible. The men in the restaurant were dead because of her. This world was a meat grinder, and it eventually chewed up everyone who stepped into it. But as she looked at Nikolai's hand, She felt the phantom sensation of the heavy silk sliding over her skin. She remembered the sheer intoxicating rush of leaning into a Mafia boss and dictating the survival of the room. She thought about Claude snapping his fingers at her. She thought about the endless grey expanse of 50 more years trapped in poverty, counting pennies to keep the lights on, slowly dying from the inside out. Nikolai watched her eyes. He saw the cynical mathematical calculation happening in her brain. He saw the exact moment the exhausted waitress died, and the pragmatist took over. Tessa reached out. Her hand was completely steady. She didn't take the card from his fingers. She slid her hand over his, feeling the warmth of his skin and the slight grit of gunpowder still clinging to his knuckles. She curled her fingers around the plastic, pulling it slowly from his grip. 10,000 a week, Tessa said, her voice dropping, the frantic pitch of fear settling into a cold, flat register that perfectly matched his own. After taxes, Nikolai's mouth curved into a slow, devastating smile. The apex predator hadn't just found a new puzzle. He had found a partner. After taxes, Nikolai agreed. Tessa tucked the card into her trenchcoat pocket. She didn't say goodnight. She turned, pushed the heavy door open, and stepped out into the freezing rain. She walked up the concrete steps to her apartment, her spine straight, the cheap heels clicking against the pavement with the heavy, undeniable cadence of a woman who finally owned the ground she walked on. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you loved Tessa's incredible transformation from an exhausted waitress to the most dangerous woman in the criminal underworld. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new audio drama, and drop a comment below. Would you have taken the black card or walked away to live a normal life? Your support helps keep these stories coming. Let me know what you want to hear next, and stay tuned for more thrilling storytelling.